Actually, for sake of time, let's just get started because I don't want to hold people up. It is 1:02. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is a Lunch and Learn webinar today being hosted by Women for a Healthy Environment, and I am pleased to welcome all of you to this program. I am Michelle Naccarati-Chapkis, Executive Director at Women for a Healthy Environment, and I am pleased to be able to introduce Morgan and Jess, whom you will hear from today, about PFAS and the concerns that we know about those particular class of chemicals, where they've been found, and what some solutions might be for addressing the exposure moving forward. So just a little bit of background for those who may not know. Women for a Healthy Environment is a nonprofit organization. We are located here in Pittsburgh. We also have staff in Philadelphia. We focus on the environmental exposures that impact public health, and we do that through four main program areas: healthy homes, healthy schools, healthy early learning centers, and then in a health policy advocacy space. And if you think about the things that weave all of that together, it is really protecting the health and well-being of children, the next generation, and in all the spaces that they live and learn and play. Our goal is to create a thriving, healthy, sustainable community all across the Commonwealth, and we do that through educational programming and technical assistance, also through programs such as what you hear and learn from today, as well as advocating for policy changes that we know better protect our health. And so from that perspective, we were very fortunate to have with us this summer Morgan Suntken, who was the Environmental Health Fellow for Women for a Healthy Environment. And she had been with us for probably about 6 months or so. And through that experience, we had an opportunity to really look into the science a lot more in a space that we have been very active in as it relates to PFAS exposure. And Morgan had a particular interest in understanding and wanting to know more about what PFAS levels could look like in waterways, and that's where she spent her effort. I will turn it over to Morgan, and she will give you a brief bio of herself and what she's been up to. And then I'm also pleased to introduce Jess Friss, who is with the Three Rivers Waterkeeper, another nonprofit organization that we collaborate with on this project. And we're so fortunate to be able to have, again, their expertise and assistance at the table. So after Morgan is done, just to give you a framework for the agenda today, she will pass it over to Jess, who will share some information with you as well. We will have the Q&A available, and this is being recorded. Q&A, feel free to use in the buttons down below. We will also try and monitor chat if anybody puts anything there. And as that information comes in through Q&A, I will be posing those questions to Morgan and Jess to get answers for all of you. So with that, I will turn it over to Morgan, please, to kick us off.
Hi, everyone. Morgan Suntken. Like Michelle said, I was an environmental health fellow at WE, and I am a MPH student studying environmental health promotion policy at the University of Michigan. And Michelle, did you want me to start my presentation now, or just?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. Let me try to share my screen correctly. Are you able to see it? Okay. So I'll be going over the report that I created during my time as Environmental Health Fellow, 3 Rivers, 15 PFAS, assessing the influence of wastewater effluent on surface water contamination with PFAS in Pittsburgh's 3 Rivers. So I'll just start by giving an overview of PFAS to make sure we're all on the same page, go over WE's background with PFAS work, and then I'll talk about our study and the conclusions and recommendations that came from it. So starting with what are PFAS? They are a class of thousands of human-made chemicals marked by their unique persistent bonds, these bonds that don't occur naturally or fully break down naturally either. And so they have numerous applications due to these stain, water, grease, and dirt repellent characteristics that they imbue in products. So some products that they're present in include water-resistant, waterproof products like clothing, rain jackets, paint, cosmetics, carpet, pesticides, microwave popcorn bags, other stain-resistant products like furniture and different sprays, fast food packaging and other prepared foods packaging, non-stick cookware, personal care products, and really importantly, firefighting foams, including Class B aqueous film forming foam, which we'll talk about in a moment. So because of those unique chemical bonds, they persist in the environment, which is why they are commonly referred to as forever chemicals. They also have the ability to bioaccumulate in living organisms, particularly fish, are a main concern for that as well. So looking broadly at how PFAS enter our environment and our homes, so it starts with the production and the use in different industries, and then it enters the environment either through these products that are made or through these different waste streams. So wastewater from industry is either discharged into the stream or sent to wastewater treatment plants. And through those wastewater treatment plants, then it enters the rivers and surface waters through wastewater discharge, or it can enter water indirectly through the land application of biosolids, which is a main issue for agriculture as well. So there's the summary of this is that there's a wide variety of ways that these enter our environment, our homes, and our bodies. But what we're going to focus on with this project is particularly wastewater treatment plants and their discharge into rivers and streams. So looking at exposure routes, PFAS we're exposed to PFAS in several ways. So one is skin absorption. This thankfully appears to be a lower risk than other routes of exposure, but due to the wide variety of products I mentioned that contain PFAS, this is an area of current research. Inhalation is another exposure route. So household dust or aerosols PFAS due to like proximity to manufacturing emissions or to like waste incinerators, or from using a PFAS containing spray. So like I go camping a lot, I waterproofed my tents, and I breathe that straight in. So yeah. And ingestion is another main exposure route. So that includes drinking water, food, accidentally eating contaminated soil, like hand-to-mouth behaviors, as well as I've mentioned, wild-caught fish and game and breast milk. And current evidence shows that ingestion is a primary route of concern, particularly through food. But if you are in areas with elevated ground and surface water contamination, then drinking water is the primary concern. So quick overview of the health effects of PFAS. There are many. So this includes reduced immune system function, different cancers, reproductive and developmental health effects, liver damage, thyroid disease and dysfunction, increased cholesterol levels, and digestive issues like inflammatory bowel disease. So just as there are a wide range of different PFAS chemicals, there's also a wide range of different health effects associated with them and associated with different compounds. So looking at WE's history in PFAS work, so in July 16th, 2021, there was a fire in the lower 10th ward of McKeesport, and aqueous film forming foam backflowed into the drinking water supply. So as I mentioned, those are PFAS containing firefighting foams. So in the aftermath, we distributed zero water filters to the affected community. Zero water filters are NSF certified to remove PFOA and PFOS, so that lowers people's risk of exposure. We also collaborates with Dr. Carla Ng and her team at the Pitt Swanson School of Engineering to assess this ongoing contamination. That's sort of how we got our interest in looking at other PFAS issues in the region. So we wanted to look at, so we know aqueous film forming foam is an issue locally that we've dealt with, and there's so much national attention paid to drinking water, but what are the other systems that are of concern? So wastewater treatment plants were the main concern that we thought we could target to better understand how they affect our surface water levels of PFAS. So we chose these three sites, these three wastewater treatment plants, and on the three rivers. So for the Allegheny, we looked at the Allegheny Valley Joint Sewage Authority. And for the Monongahela, we looked at the McKeesport Wastewater Treatment Plant, which was located right next to the backflow, AFFF backflow site. We also looked at the Ohio River and sampled from Alcosan. So for each site, we collected an upstream sample, approximately 15 meters upstream on the river. And then we also collected a mixing zone sample. So that's where the outfall from the wastewater treatment plant actually combines with the river water. So we took many, many steps to mitigate the risk of outside contamination. Sampling for PFAS is a very tricky project because, like I said, so many clothes and products contain it. So we had to really make sure to control for outside factors like that. Collected the samples using HDPE bottles dipped below the surface interface. So we dipped them 3 times and collected from the 4th. And these samples that you see in this picture, these bottles, they were then poured into these collection cups. So the cyclopure test kit. So the sample will then, the water will flow through the pad at the bottom, and the PFAS is actually extracted from the water. And for quality assurance, we also used a field blank. So PFAS-free deionized water from a lab was poured through a test kit on site to test for our controls. And we also collected a duplicate to validate our results. And so for our overall findings, we found stark increases in the number of PFAS detected from the upstream sample to the mixing zone sample. So starting with alkazan, we detected 2 different compounds in the upstream, but 6 in the mixing zone. On the Allegheny River, we saw 1 in the upstream, but at the mixing zone for the AVJSA outfall, we saw 12 different PFAS compounds. For McKeesport, there were 3 in the upstream and then 9 in the mixing zone. So we're seeing just the quantity of different types of PFAS that we're able to detect increasing. That's as well as stark increases in total PFAS in parts per trillion from the upstream to the mixing zone sample. So for alkazan, across the different PFAS compounds we detected, there were 3.7 parts per trillion in the upstream, but then 15.3 in the mixing zone. For AVJSA, it was 1.2 parts per trillion in the upstream sample. And then for the mixing zone, it was 36.1 parts per trillion. And for the McKeesport test site, there were 3.4 parts per trillion in the upstream sample, and then 26.3 in the mixing zone. So then if we look at these individually by the results we see on the left on this table, they're the upstream results, and on the right is the mixing zone. So in the upstream sample, we only detected PFOS on the Allegheny River. And then in the mixing zone, we detected many. And that's because if you look on the left in the environmental working group map, all of these green dots are suspected users of PFAS, and the purple dots are landfills and waste disposal facilities. So all of those different users north of the river could be discharging to this wastewater treatment plant, and ultimately their wastewater can be reaching this river. And so particularly when we look at the maximum contaminant level for PFOS in drinking water, it's set at 4.0 parts per trillion. And for the mixing zone here, we see 6.9. So that's an exceedance. And looking at the Monongahela River samples, we see that 3 different PFAS compounds were detected for 3.4 parts per trillion in the upstream, but then 26.3 parts per trillion in the mixing zone. And one of those detected, MEFBSA, is used in dyes and print works. And as we see on this map, there are many suspected users of PFAS upstream, which could be why we picked that one up in the stream sample. But importantly, looking at EJ screen, we see that this area located near our sample site is above the 90 to 95th percentile for the EJ screen score relating to wastewater discharge. So it's important to recognize that this is an environmental justice community when it comes to wastewater discharge particularly, and that this issue of the wastewater from this wastewater treatment plant contaminating the river is not happening in a vacuum as we see. And lastly, looking at the Ohio River samples, there were 2 different PFAS compounds detected in the upstream for 3.7 parts per trillion, and then 15.3 in the mixing zone. And again, we see that FBSA, but looking at this map of all these orange dots, like ultimately all of these are leading to the Ohio River. So it's no surprise that we found some other PFAS compounds. PFOS is pretty permeates most of our environment, so it's expected that we would detect that. But also looking here, PFOS again was an exceedance of that 4.0 part per trillion MCL. So it's a lot of numbers, but in summary, we did see stark increases in the number and the total PFAS detected in the mixing zone compared to the upstream, 2 exceedances of the drinking water MCL, and 15 PFAS compounds detected in total. So what this means is it confirms our hypothesis that wastewater treatment plants are a major source of PFAS contamination of our environment locally, and that PA should take initiative and act quickly to both understand the extent of this issue, but also to seek every opportunity to remove PFAS from our supply chains and our environment. So putting the findings into perspective, again, these are the results for only 3 out of the 24 wastewater treatment plants identified, so a small sliver of the extent of the problem. And this is only one waste stream and does not account for the cumulative impact of waste from other waste streams, including these industrial discharges, landfills, and the land application of biosolids that I've discussed. So essentially, there are many complex pathways for PFAS to get into the environment, which means there is a pressing need for complex data to understand that issue. And so considerations for environmental justice, just briefly, the definition is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So as discussed, particularly the McKeesport location is considered an environmental justice community. And research shows that communities of color are more impacted by PFAS contamination of drinking water due to this disproportionate proximity to PFAS users and emitters. So the main concerns here in pertaining to PFAS and environmental justice are the location of waste discharge in industrial sites, in addition to the location of wastewater treatment plants, the affordability of remediation and filtration. Even just point of use, like filters in your home, are quite expensive. Whole home filters are extremely expensive. And for water treatment, drinking water treatment facilities to install PFAS filters is very expensive. So the concern is the expense for these falling on the ratepayer. Also, the lack of information made available to the public on this issue, like we mentioned, we aren't collecting this data and publicly reporting it on PFAS in our waste streams. It's a really important issue. And also, all decision-making affects those downstream. So ultimately, the Ohio River is the drinking water supply for 5 million people once it leaves our region. And what we do affects those people as well. So policy recommendations are key ones for federal is that PFAS should be regulated as a class to avoid harmful substitutes. Right now, we are regulating only a small handful of the thousands of PFAS that exist. And that wastewater treatment plants should be required to monitor PFAS in their waters, in their influent and in their effluent, so we can determine the sources of environmental PFAS contamination and target the response. There should also be an investment in sustainable chemistry research to find safe alternatives to PFAS. Like we said, PFAS are in so many different products. If we remove those, there's going to be something else. So we need to make sure that we have safe alternatives for that. And looking at PA, should prohibit the sale and distribution of PFAS in consumer products in the state. So that includes food packaging, cosmetics and hygiene, building materials, etc. There are several states acting to restrict the sale and distribution of PFAS consumer products, so there's no reason that we can't look to do the same. Also, we believe that they should require and publicly disclose the testing of wastewater treatment plant influent effluent to assess PFAS contamination. Ultimately, we can't wait for the EPA to act. We really need to start collecting this data immediately. And so looking at consumer recommendations, there's a bunch, but ultimately, even though we need a lot of regulatory action at the state and federal level, there are things that we can do to sort of lower our risk. So some are like avoiding stain-resistant products and sprays, finding safer alternatives like beeswax, being critical of products marketed as like free of specific PFAS. For example, if something says it's PFOA or PFOS free, that doesn't mean that there isn't a PFAS in it. So for cookware in particular, using glass, stainless steel, and cast iron cookware are safer alternatives. For food, avoiding fast food and packaged foods is ideal, as well as avoiding wild caught fish and wildlife in areas known to be contaminated. So try to be aware of where your food is being sourced from. As mentioned, microwave popcorn bags are a big issue, so avoid those if you can. Finding an NSF certified water filter in your home, either just at your faucet or for your whole home if you can do it. It's a really great way to lower your drinking water risk. And personal care products, PFAS are also in a ton of different products. So checking the ingredients. Also, you can look at databases like Environmental Working Group, or they have an app that you can search products on to check to see what the risk of PFAS is from that. So yeah, that's everything. So to review the full report, this is only a small snippet of it. You can go to our website at policy/reports and access that. And if you have any questions or you want to get in touch, my email is on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. I also did put a link to the report in the chat here for folks to access. So you talked about maximum contaminant level. Folks may have seen the MCL that was referenced. Can you talk a little bit about what that means so that people can put that into context?
Yeah, so that's an enforceable contaminant level in drinking water supplies. So since there isn't an enforceable level for surface water or for wastewater, we use that as a comparison just to see how it measures up to the standards that do exist. So that's the level where like a drinking water system would have to act to reduce their level of PFAS. So 2 of our mixing zone samples, the PFOS was above the MCL. So that means that like even though we aren't drinking this water straight from the river, it is treated first. It does show that the source water that ultimately provides drinking water for many systems is being contaminated above the MCL.
Thank you. And in terms of some of the PFAS that you were seeing upstream, can you speak to, from the perspective of state policy needs and such, does DEP require a permit to discharge any type of PFAS so that we can have a better understanding of the amount being discharged and the source?
So there's really limited requirements for reporting these things in general when it comes to PFAS. That's something that there's national attention being paid to, like adding them to disclosure list. Really right now, most attention, both in PA and federally, is just focused on drinking water. So that's a really big issue, is because we're not really understanding where it's all coming from. Hence our report.
Thank you. And then I'll just go to a couple of questions that are in the chat here. One of the questions was, did Dr. Carla Engie and her team create the sampling protocol for you?
No, so I designed the sampling protocol by consulting, so PADEP, Michigan Environment, their department as well, and different states who do statewide PFAS surface water testing. I reviewed all of their reports to design it, and then I kind of made my plan and I ran it past Carla's team. But so they helped me, like gave advice throughout this process, but ultimately it was just reading like a ton of reports from different environmental departments.
Hence all the research that went into it. Thank you. Let's keep going with questions here because we do want to get to Jess as well. So PFAS seem to have really made a presence in the news in the past couple of years. Did something specific happen that brought awareness to this issue, or has it been around for a long time? Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think it's until now, it's kind of been an unseen environmental crisis in the making. There's been multiple situations, like, for example, half an hour from where I grew up in Michigan, there's in Rockford, Michigan, the wells are permanently, at least for the foreseeable future, condemned due to PFAS contamination. So there's been different sites where there's such extreme levels. I think the main one that we've seen is like a lot of Navy bases due to their use of aqueous film forming foam, that we see groundwater systems that are condemned. You can't use the water there. Cancer clusters located around these. So I think it's just kind of taken a lot of media attention and a lot of like grassroots work testing these and like publicizing the issue to get people to pay attention. But it's something that's just hasn't been known, even though it's been known by the people affected.
It certainly has been around it's been a decades old problem, and the science and research has come along dramatically over the years to show the linkages between PFAS exposure and health impacts. And so I think that also is contributing. One of the other questions here is says one question I had was about monitoring CSOs versus wastewater treatment plant outfalls. Are there any future plans to monitor those outfalls during wet weather?
So I don't know what if PA is planning anything or if other groups are planning anything. I think that would be really important to look at that. I know it was something that we kind of struggled with trying to find a time where it wasn't raining and we didn't have to worry about the outfalls as much. So I think it's a really important issue, and it's why for me, it's why I think it's so important to collect the samples directly from the wastewater treatment plants themselves, to require them to be collecting the samples consistently. So we're able to monitor how these different conditions affect it, like times during wet weather when we have overflows. Like for example, in Michigan, they have to regularly test the water they're receiving and the water they're discharging. So we have like an idea of the different conditions that can affect PFAS levels, the sources that PFAS is coming from. So I think it's really important that this information is collected by the system, but not at the ratepayer's expense.
And is Michigan the gold standard, would you say, based on all the research that you did in terms of requirements for testing?
I'm a little biased. I think Michigan has done a great job of that. I think because they were affected by different contamination sites, but I know that other states are taking more action right now too. Like for example, I believe Maine has banned the use of biosolids for land application. So this is something that, like, watching other states, what they're doing right now, it's consistently unfolding. Like they're continuing to tighten the regulations and really look at exploring these data. So.
Yeah. And so you had talked about rain events. Did you notice fluctuations due to weather conditions, or did you try to keep a consistent approach to your collection methods?
So we collect, sorry. Yeah, we collected all of our samples on the same day. We kind of waited because the summer was a little strange between like droughts and then a ton of water. So we kind of waited until the CSO advisories had subsided to collect them. They were all collected on the same day. But ideally these would be continually collected over different rain events.
Unfortunately, we had you for a very short window, and, and we need Morgan for a 2-year period. Can you tell everybody what CSO is, please? Morgan, folks may have a question about that acronym.
Yes, so that's a combined sewer overflow. So like we have combined sewer systems where both stormwater and sewer water are tracked through the same system and treated by the same plant. So when there is an extreme rain event, or depending on the quality of the system, any rain event, the stormwater can cause the system to overflow, and then you have untreated stormwater and sewage directly entering our streams.
Thank you. And last question, and then we'll turn it over to Jess, is so can you just summarize then what your hypothesis was around the wastewater treatment, the effluent, the mixing zones, why they were at such greater, higher numbers of PFAS compared to what you were collecting upstream?
Yeah, so basically the results kind of confirmed what we believed, that we would see this. That's because wastewater, like municipal wastewater systems, are kind of the culmination of all these different pathways for PFAS to enter the environment. So we're draining personal care products, hygiene products down the drain. Stormwater is also collecting it, the wastewater itself, but also wastewater coming from industrial sources. They're kind of all converging here. So that's why we would expect to see PFAS. That's also why it's so important to monitor these sources.
Thank you. Appreciate your time, Morgan, and your study and all of the information. So again, the full report is in the chat here that you can access, as well as on the website now at Women for Healthy Environment under the Take Action section. And I did want to just give a shout out to the Heinz Endowments and the Community Foundation for the Alleghenies for their generous support, which allowed us the funding to be able to have this work completed and to have Morgan on as an environmental health fellow with the organization. So let's turn it over to Jess. Jess Friss is with the Three Rivers Waterkeeper. Jess, it's nice to have you with us this afternoon, and it's nice to be able to have this collaboration effort between the two organizations. I know that Morgan spoke very highly of being out with all of you out on the river and how you all were able to learn from each other. So why don't you talk, please introduce yourself, a little bit of a bio here, and tell us a little bit about your work, Jess.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on this webinar. And we were really excited when Morgan had reached out to us with kind of like the start of this project and this interest in wanting to collect data around our rivers, which is really crucial to us. So I do have a presentation I'll share now, and we can go a bit more in depth with who Three Rivers Waterkeeper is and kind of what we do. So my name is Jess Friss. I'm the Director of Community Programs at Three Rivers Waterkeeper. Hopefully you guys can see the presentation. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So a little bit about our organization. We are a local environmental nonprofit that works in Southwestern PA on our rivers and tributaries. And our mission is to protect the water quality of the Monongahela, Allegheny, and Ohio rivers and their respective watersheds. And we have a vision to have drinkable, fishable, swimmable waters in our region. And we're a part of the Waterkeeper Alliance. So the Waterkeeper Alliance connects waterkeepers all over the globe in a similar mission to their local waterways. And as I mentioned, we work in Southwestern PA, and our jurisdiction, meaning like the area that we're kind of designated to be responsible for, begins at the confluence of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers, which many people refer to locally as the Point. We then work up each river and down the Ohio River to the third dam on each river. And together this totals about 125 river miles along with their associated watersheds. And you can see on the map kind of an overview of where we work and the waterways that we work in. And then just a general overview of what we do. Our work is currently broken down into 3 categories where we work on the water to be a critical presence in the community to educate and empower residents, and then through advocacy to protect our right to clean water. And today I'm going to kind of focus a little bit more on our water efforts, where we do baseline and targeted monitoring, responding to pollution incidents, and attempting to hold polluters accountable for water pollution. So part of our water monitoring includes PFAS chemicals, and this kind of started in 2021 when the Waterkeeper Alliance did a nationwide PFAS study that we were involved in. So waterkeepers across the US tested for PFAS contamination in US waterways using CycloPure water test kits, as pictured in the image. And Morgan had also mentioned using the CycloPure test kits. So we did both upstream and downstream of an identified potential source of PFAS contamination. And this is some of what the Waterkeeper Alliance's study found. So at least one PFAS chemical was detected in 95 of the 114 waterways sampled. That's about 83%. The study also found that PFAS chemicals were found in measurable concentrations in at least one water in 29 states and DC, out of the 34 states and DC where monitoring was conducted. And you can read the Waterkeeper Alliance's full PFAS study on their website. I can also drop the link in the chat after this presentation. So this is kind of what led us to conduct our own localized PFAS study. Our work on the water includes targeted monitoring, and this is where we focus on known issues in the river, from things like pollution reports and known water permit violations, large industries along the waterway, and issues that we find when we're on patrol on the boat. And so the goal of our PFAS study was to get a baseline of PFAS in Pittsburgh's waterways on the main stem rivers and their tributaries, and to identify sources of PFAS pollution with 30 plus samples throughout our region. And so this study is ongoing, and we're hoping to release more information about it once we complete more samples. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what we found so far. And so this is our area of study. So currently we've taken about 30 water samples to analyze for PFAS in our region. And you can see on the map where we've taken samples so far. And it's kind of evenly distributed along our main stem rivers and their tributaries. This is the same map as before, only this time the dots are representative of the total amount of PFAS chemicals in parts per trillion that were found in the samples. So notably, the 3 locations with the largest PFAS contamination were samples taken from Montour Run, which is a tributary of the Ohio River, a sample taken at the Boston Boat Launch, which is a public boat ramp on the Allegheny River, which is a tributary of the Monongahela River, and a sample taken from a section of Spears Run, which is a tributary of the Monongahela River. So I want to go a little bit more into the data that we found from the samples. So because we took so many samples for the purpose of this presentation, we've kind of divided them up into these rivershed areas. So this graph specifically represents samples that were taken either along the Allegheny River or in tributaries that will flow into the Allegheny River. So notably, the area with the highest concentration of PFAS on or near the Allegheny River was Little Deer Creek, with total PFAS concentration of 35.6 parts per trillion. And so what this kind of does is this allows us to note that Little Deer Creek is an area that we want to do further investigation in as to why it had a higher concentration of PFAS chemicals, what the potential source of contamination could be, industries around that area, and it kind of calls us to do more sampling in that area. This graph represents samples that were taken either along the Monongahela River or in tributaries that will flow into the Monongahela River. So notably, the highest concentration of PFAS chemicals were found at one of the sites I mentioned on the slide with the map. It's called Johnson Ave, which is the location where we sampled Spears Run, downstream of a landfill that's located there. And when we got the results back, we found that there was about 126.8 parts per trillion of total PFAS contamination. And then Boston Boat Launch is also mentioned. They had a total PFAS concentration of 89.3 parts per trillion. And then lastly, this graph represents samples that were taken either along the Ohio River or in tributaries that will flow into the Ohio River. As you can see, the site for Montour Run that I also mentioned had a high concentration of PFAS chemicals in the sample that was taken, with about 134.9 parts per trillion total PFAS contamination. And to kind of put this in perspective, this was mentioned kind of in Morgan's presentation as well, about the idea of the contamination of PFAS in our source water versus what our drinking water standards are. And so the Environmental Protection Agency has these new national primary drinking water regulations for 6 specific PFAS chemicals in our drinking water. This is what they consider a safe amount of PFAS to be allowed in public water systems. So after water is taken from its source water, like the areas in which we are sampling, and then cleaned at a water authority, the maximum amount of a specific PFAS chemical, PFOA, is 4 parts per trillion. So considering, from Morgan's presentation, those specific PFAS contaminations for specific PFAS chemicals, taking that from the source water, if it's higher than what is allowed to be in the water after it's cleaned, then the water authority then has to use resources to take the PFAS chemical out of the water, and that can cause ratepayers to be responsible for the cost of those resources. So the results of our study overall, we have had about 30 PFAS tests completed and analyzed so far. PFAS were detected 21 times out of those 30 tests, which is about 70% of the time. And the highest total PFAS was found at Montour Run, a tributary of the Ohio River, with 134.9 parts per trillion total PFAS detected. So again, the goal of this study was to kind of get a baseline level of PFAS contamination in our region and to then identify these potential sources of PFAS contamination. So for Montour Run, a potential source of PFAS contamination could be the Pittsburgh International Airport, which is located upstream of Montour Run. So any water or rain that falls on an area always wants to run downstream, go downhill. And so areas that are downstream or downhill of a waterway, or when a waterway is downstream of an area that has contamination, that waterway is then affected by that contamination. And so Montour Run, like I said before, had total PFAS contamination of 134.9 parts per trillion. And there was about 15 different types or compounds of PFAS chemicals found. And airports are known contributors of large amount of PFAS contamination just because up until recently, the Federal Aviation Administration required that these commercial airports train and use firefighting foam to fight petroleum-based fires that contain PFAS chemicals as a key component. So that firefighting foam that Morgan mentioned. This is why areas like airports, firefighting training bases, military bases are large contributors of PFAS contamination because they're using this PFAS foam on the ground. It rains or they wash it away. It goes downhill into our waterways. And then another potential source of PFAS contamination is a targeted monitoring site that we have, which is the Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill. This is when I mentioned that we had sampled Spears Run downstream of a landfill. It was the Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill, which is located in Ross Draver Township. And this landfill is known to take fracking waste, which in a report by Physicians for Social Responsibility documented that PFAS chemicals have been used in several Pennsylvania fracking wells. And while the chemicals that are injected into the ground and pulled back out during fracking operations are considered trade secrets and are often undisclosed, it's expected that PFAS chemicals are being used in oil and gas wells throughout the country. And this is kind of important to consider because landfills have to deal with something called leachate. And leachate from a landfill is just the name for the liquid that is formed when water, like rain, comes in contact with waste in the landfill. And this liquid leaches the chemicals and other things in the waste. And when there's fracking waste in the landfill, this leachate, it just has so much PFAS from the fracking waste. And in the late summer of 2022, it was reported that the Westmoreland Sanitary Landfill spilled an unknown volume of leachate where it eventually made its way into their stormwater upon discharge and into Spears Run. And so we went and took PFAS samples both upstream and downstream of the landfill and found that there was a considerably higher amount of PFAS downstream of the landfill at 126.8 parts per trillion compared to upstream when there was 16.1 parts per trillion. And then a year later, we returned to take more PFAS samples and found low levels of PFAS both upstream and downstream of the landfill. And then we also sampled the Monongahela River near the landfill, and it had 7.2 parts per trillion total PFAS contamination. So this is what we've learned from our PFAS study so far. Overall, PFAS detection was low in most sites, but not zero. Our main stem rivers had low values of PFAS contamination. We're still identifying sources of PFAS contamination, especially in locations that had high concentrations of PFAS and no immediately known source. And PFAS contamination can happen from an event such as a leachate spill at a landfill. And lastly, the lack of regulation on discharge of PFAS into our waterways by industry, but strict regulation on drinking water standards for PFAS puts the burden on ratepayers. And so effectively, we need stronger effluent discharge regulations. Thank you so much for your time. If you'd like to keep in touch with what we're doing, please follow us on social media, sign up for our newsletter on our website, and we hope to see you at one of our events in the future, out on the water and recreating on our rivers. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jess. I appreciate that. It was really striking how you could see those high levels, knowing that there has been a linkage between PFAS and the contamination and used at airports, training facilities, even some of, the old hangar at the airport, which is used by Department of Defense. And I know that from a federal perspective, the Department of Defense had made, I believe, a commitment over the last year or so to phase out PFAS. Do either of you have any more information about that?
From my understanding, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, has picked like one firefighting foam that does not contain PFAS on their list of approved firefighting foams that airports can use. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the airport then has to change what firefighting foam they use. It just means that there is now one available for them to use that does not contain PFAS.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And it is certainly an issue that the organizations here have been concerned about. And I know that certainly Women for a Healthy Environment has reached out to the airport authorities in trying to learn, understand, and under what the plan is for phasing out the PFAS usage. And from a policy perspective, have been working with volunteer firefighters and professional firefighters across the state to really provide and put together an education program so that firefighters would know more about the chemicals that are being used whenever they are like the AFFF, whenever they're out to fight a fire, and how to reduce and potentially even eliminate exposure. So let's see. Somebody here has said they wonder about how our hilly terrain influences the flow of bad stuff compared to other areas. Any thoughts or reactions to that?
Yeah, so in general, everywhere water flows downhill. And so because we have these mountainous or hilly regions, the water or any contamination on the top. So if people live, kind of at the top of a hill and they're producing some type of pollution, it will wash down into our waterways. But that does happen everywhere.
So it certainly is a factor that's contributing to the exposure. There's a question in the Q&A that speaks to what the state is doing, the current status of the state's monitoring of PFAS in PA here. And so under the former administration, under Governor Wolf, there was a PFAS advisory council that had been put together, made up of the secretaries from all of the agencies, as well as other individuals who were came together to put together a PFAS action plan. And so with the research that the two of you have been doing, do you have anything new to share in terms of what the current administration is doing now as it relates to PFAS and that action plan that had been put together? Did you come across any of the recent activities, or perhaps any monitoring plans that will continue through DEP?
So one thing that I reviewed heavily in designing, both in like designing my project and comparing the results, this was in 2019, so outdated, but hopefully this will be repeated, was the statewide sampling project by the USGS and DEP. And from that, they kind of reported some land use associations, but it wasn't targeted to look at specific emitters or users of PFAS. It was just like widespread testing across the state, and then they analyzed the data to find potential sources. So I think from my perspective, what needs to be happening is like more targeted collection of this data and analysis. But hopefully that's something that will be repeated. Yeah, that's kind of all I have.
Thank you. And I did put in the chat for folks to access the DEP website that does have the what's new section in terms of some things that have been happening. So you'll see there a link to PFAS, the final drinking water regulation, which was published in the bulletin, the PA bulletin in January of 2023. It does have also a link to the statewide sampling plan's final results, as well as the action team's initial report. And so we definitely know that more work needs to be done at the state level with our agencies. And I think that came through certainly in the recommendations that have been provided in the report. Morgan, certainly as it relates to where we see other states moving forward and making a commitment and taking action, and that Pennsylvania should follow suit, certainly. Okay, let's see here. So here's a comment, says, thank you. Great presentation, Jess. I think that the last point that you mentioned in the summary is so important. Ratepayers should not pay more for more industrial pollution. And so that's something that I heard both of you say, and is an important fact to reiterate, is that we know that through these industrial point sources where there has been contamination, that the obligation should be on the companies, the sources that have polluted the streams, the rivers, the waterways, to be able to go back in and provide the funding and mechanism for cleanup, so that we as ratepayers wouldn't have to bear that burden through higher costs in our bills. And so, whether that's a sewage bill, our drinking water bills, et cetera. And so that is something I think that all of us are cognizant of, certainly is, and you both made point of mentioning that, we see high concentrations in environmental justice communities that we know are already heavily burdened. And so certainly that's something that we want to make sure that regulators here at the various state agencies, as well as the local water systems too. So that's something else that comes through and is a point to reiterate. So how will this program's recording be available? Great question. We will upload it to YouTube, and that will be a place to access. We'll make it available to anybody so that you can go in and share and go back and see the information that was presented today. If you have any further questions, Jess and Morgan, can you please put your emails in the chat here? So we'll give a moment to pause so that you can do that, so that if anybody has some questions following up from the conversation today, they can reach out to either of you to be able to get those questions answered. And then while you're doing that, I'm going to go back into the Q&A. Okay, here's another one that I want to make sure gets addressed because we just have a few more minutes here. So for both of you, how many of the thousands of PFAS substances did you test for in your respective studies, knowing that there are so many in this class of chemicals, and that you can't test for all of them, but you did narrow down that. Do you want to talk a little bit about your approach to which of the PFAS chemicals you had tested for, and perhaps the why behind that?
Yeah.
Well, we both use the same testing kits, so kind of the same answer from both of us. But so the Cyclopure test kits test for 55 PFAS compounds and precursors. So they validated their results against the EPA methods. They are not a EPA certified lab, partially because they test for additional compounds that aren't covered by the EPA yet. But unfortunately, we don't have tests for all of the thousands of chemicals, ways to detect them yet. But from the one thing I want to say about Cyclopure, so their test kits cost $79 on their website per kit, whereas one of the quotes that we got from a lab was almost $700 for one sample. So these test kits are one of the startup companies that are really innovating different ways to test for PFAS to make it more affordable and accessible. Still $79 a sample is a lot, but it does make it a lot more easy, considering that the sample itself, you filter the water through and the PFAS is extracted on site. So it's definitely a huge step in the right direction of making this testing more affordable. But Jess, if you have anything to add.
Not much. I think you covered it. It's just Cyclopure is the organization whose test kits we have been using since the start. We used them during the Waterkeeper Alliance's PFAS study. And like Morgan mentioned, they're not certified results, but they do use EPA methods, and they are extremely easy to use, especially considering a lot of the times when we're doing water sampling and analysis, that the water has to be sent to a lab to analyze, whereas with these CycloPure test kits, it's just that absorbent pad that gets sent at the end, which makes it extremely more efficient to get results back.
Thank you both for your answers. And I do want to give a shout out to the Zero Water water filter water pitcher that filters for PFAS. And so when we had the contamination in McKeesport, Women for a Healthy Environment had deployed its Zero Water pitchers that we had been previously using for removing lead in drinking water to, and we called the company at that point and said, does it also remove PFAS? And they indicated it did, and that it would be safe to use and effective, our primary concern. And so we had distributed those water pitchers in the 10th ward. And with Dr. Enge's work at Pitt, then she had taken the samples from the water pitchers themselves, the filters of the water pitchers, back to the lab, and indeed was able to confirm that those particular water pitchers were doing what they are supposed to do, and they were filtering out the PFAS in the drinking water. It's a pitcher system, so it doesn't mount to your faucet, but very effective to fill up a water pitcher and put it on your counter or put it in your refrigerator and use it. So just a shout out for folks who might be looking for a particular water pitcher that removes PFAS as well as other contaminants in drinking water effectively and at a reasonable cost that it can be found at the big box retailers. So with that, I believe that we have answered all of the questions and we are at our hour. So we did really great in terms of sticking to time and making it a true lunch and learn over a 1 hour period. Hopefully people were able to join us here over lunch and learn something new. You both, the work that you've done within your respective organizations and the amount of research that is going into this really critical work in an area of study is to be commended. We are very appreciative of both of you sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and your time with us here today. And I look forward to hearing more about the research to come in the future. In the meantime, we as a community can work collectively to advocate for the policy changes that we know are needed. And so that is something that I would share with all of you if you are listening to this and learning something new today in terms of what you can do. Certainly, you heard a lot about where PFAS is located in consumer products, and you can reduce your exposure there, but also using your voice in terms of advocacy for policy change is very critical too. So, stay tuned to Three Rivers Waterkeeper and Women for a Healthy Environment as we call for some policy changes and advocacy needs in the months to come. But in the meantime, thank you for being with all of us here today. We hope you've learned something new. And again, Morgan and Jess, thank you for your time and your work. With that, we will close out our day. Take care, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.